Yo, Parish Orbits and Retrogrades. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Rules for Retrogrades. Today, joining me is my friend and sometimes guest, Mr. Stephen O'Reilly, who's the editor of Roma Locuta Est. Stephen, thanks for joining me today. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so it's always great to have you on, and we've met in person. I always enjoy having guests that I've met in the flesh. Look, a couple big things. Two of the sage elders in the church, the Cardinal Muller and Cardinal Sarah, have both said things that they were not willing to say before. Cardinal Muller has essentially said it, and then it by all appearances, taken it back. He said that Francis has committed plenty of material heresies. No one should be scandalized by this. Material heresy is kind of a prima facie, by definition, prima facie thing. And I could show you, I think there are at least a dozen of these things in Amoris Laetitia alone that are material heresy. Formal heresy is the way they think. He seems to have taken it back because he said it's a life site. Just one of the last days of October, just published right now in terms of when I saw it, Diane Montagna tweeted that Cardinal Sarah said that the church has gone into a new phase of the crisis, magisterial crisis. What he's really saying, I think, I'm doing paraphrasing for the parish orphans and retrogrades out there, is that the crisis has reached in a way that can no longer be Pope-splained. The tippy top of the pyramid, the Pope. We've had a magisterial crisis since around Vatican II. At least at a lower level. With Francis, this is next level. What do you say? Well, we're going to talk all about potential material heresies by Francis today. You have some unique evidence I've never brought to light. I don't want to put words in your mouth, though. Can you give us a preliminary statement, then we'll back out for a second, then we'll get all the way into it.
Well, sure. Actually, I had not heard what Cardinal Sarah had said, so that's interesting to hear that. But I think he's right. I think there's a Latin phrase, which I forget offhand what it is, but I think the sense of it is that what motion accelerates at the end or towards the end. And it seems that we're getting to that stage of the crisis now. You have Francis and Fernandez is prefect of the DDF, coming out with more and more dubia answers. And then, of course, the scary one was yesterday on transgenders and same-sex godparents and all that. So I think that's just setting up things for, at some point, whether it's next year after the next part of the synod, the bless same-sex weddings or whatever, or same-sex couples. I think that's probably something that's going to, I think Francis would like to implement probably by next year. But I think we're seeing more and more scary things pop up. But in regard to the additional evidence that we've spoken about, I listened to your show on Sunday, and you're talking about the different, quote unquote, scenarios where the Pope-splainers were saying you could receive communion if you are divorced or remarried. And that reminded me, and I sent you an article I wrote back, I think it was in 2019. There was a British writer, he's a pianist, who I think wrote some books on Revelation or on prophecy, but he got into becoming a Pope-splainer way back then. He started writing for Vatican Insider, became close to, I think, to Tornielli. He actually met the Pope, and he wrote a book back in 2018 called The Pope, the Family and Divorce. And it's kind of that book's an interesting thing in itself, is that it has like a rogues gallery of people who supported him on that. I mean, Cardinal Tobin provided the Neil Opstad and imprimatur. Maradiaga helped on it. Cardinal Farrell. I mean, you kind of list a whole bunch of these kind of rogues gallery of cardinals that were involved in this thing. But anyway,
Team Francis, and Francis provided the forward. That's what we're going to
get. And that's what I'm getting to. That, but in this book, which I wrote like a long series of rebuttals to on my blog, Roma Locuta Est, there is one of those scenarios that we've talked about where Walford gives an example of where a couple who are divorced or remarried can receive communion. And it turns out that Francis wrote the preface for the book. And now he doesn't say in his preface, I concur with everything in that, but if you write a preface for something, you're giving a degree of legitimacy to it. Now the question mark, when I wrote it, I was trying to give Francis some leeway in that. It turns out when I looked into it that Francis actually wrote the preface before the book was written. He wrote like a letter to Stephen Walford, but then Walford, after he wrote his book, went back and said, can I use this as a preface? Now, Francis, so you don't want to attach something you've written to someone's book unless you have some degree of knowledge of what's in it. So presumably he's still responsible for letting his words be attached. And of course he says something, I don't have the article right here in front of me at the moment, but he says something to the effect that this book will be a great help to families. I'm certain of it.
Yeah.
But the example is, I read the whole long. It's kind of a lengthy example, but the long and short of it is, you have a couple who are divorced and remarried.
What you want to pause for 1 sec, Steve?
Yeah, sure.
I want you to break this all out. I just want to set the table a tiny bit so that people, like years and even to some extent dates for folks out there, if that's cool. So,
sure.
Okay, let's do this. First off, everyone like, subscribe, click the notification bell for this video. Please, please, please do it. If you want to support this channel, do so on Locals and Subscribe Star attached to this video. Attached to this chat, I just linked Stephen O'Reilly's article that we're going to be discussing and citing from today, right now, momentarily, so that you guys can go look at it, because you have to see this thing. It's so overwhelming now that the evidence against Francis as at least a material heretic. Mueller's now saying, ex-DDF now saying plenty of material heresies, and then taking it back. There's a risk you feel you run when a case is so strong. This is a lawyerly thing. A case is so strong against a defendant, when you're like, I'm going through the normal procedures of building a case, adducing evidence against this guy, and this almost feels trivializing because this is so obvious. And if everyone in the world was watching a TV show and a very public figure, I don't know, ex-president of the US, did something while everyone was watching, it almost feels silly to start laying out the evidence as if the case you have to build is beginning from zero or beginning from square one. That's how I feel these days doing shows like this with Francis, because again, I know I repeat it a lot, but people seem to need a lot of repeating out there. Francis published Amoris Laetitia, and this had been the plan since at least 1993, when Cardinal Casper took up the plan to get communion to the divorced and civilly remarried adulterers 12 years after JP2 had solved the issue. Okay, someone gets a divorce, gets remarried, doesn't really care about the faith when they do so, pops out another kid. That's an important element in all this, an illegitimate kid with their adulterer, second spouse, and then at some later point decides, oh, I want to have my cake and eat it too. I wanted this other hotter spouse, whatever it is, and now, but I want to go to heaven. I'm getting old, and even my new spouse is getting older too. Well, JP2 said, okay, fine, just live as brother and sister, whatever that was, Familiaris Consortio 84. Yeah. Boom, solved. That was in 1981, the year I was born. 1993, Cardinal Casper, who gave us this plan and who also doesn't believe that Jesus resurrected in reality, like many of the Germans, like most of Pope Francis's friends, they believe it's a historical critical thing, and it was grafted onto the mythology of Jesus. These are not real Christians, in my estimation. He said, oh, but I want to go back to this example, this rule-proving exception of the remarried adulterer spouse that has a new kid, I want to use the kid as a kind of cudgel, a crowbar, to allow the spouse to have sex with his concubine. But JP2 solved that 12 years ago in 1981, Cardinal Casper. Don't care. I want this guy to be able to have sex with his concubine, or really with anyone, is what they're saying. And so we're still going to use the kid as if JP2 didn't solve that. So that began in 1993. Study commissions. And it took them all the way until 2014, 2015, 21, 22 years later, to talk about it synodally. And then Francis, 23 years later, says you can do this. You can now have sex with your concubine in April of 2016 in Mors Laetitia. It was already solved in 1981, and I did this show the other day, and I know I'm repeating. Sorry, Steve, to push you back. I just want everyone who didn't see the show I did the other day to know we're not talking about, well, what do civilly divorced or remarried adulterers do if they have another kid? Do they have to leave their kid? Well, the ideal situation is, yeah, they leave with their kid, I guess, and return to their true spouse from whom they're divorced. That's the ideal situation. Francis actually calls this a sin in Amoris Laetitia. So he's wrong there. But JP2 does say, well, if you're going to stay there, that's fine. Just live in brother and sister. Casper and Francis, over the course of those 21, 22, 23 years, used study commissions to study the issue in such a way where all they're doing, and this is what all Francis' pontificate has been, Francis charges Casper and his other Sankt Gallen Mafia guys with finding a rule-swallowing exception. Can you find one exception where the principle of double effect would make it where they need to have sex with each other? They need to have adulterous, sweaty, illicit sex, or else it would be a sin. And of course, any Thomistic action theorist working out the trolley car problems here says, no, there's no situation you can't find it. And that's why you need moral philosophers on the case, not just moral theologians. Nevertheless, this is what Francis does. Step one, can a faithful Catholic, ever murder or whatever mortal sin and still go to confession? He'll answer out the next breath, no, but we must study it. Can a faithful Catholic murder? Of course not, but we need to study it. Step two, with the study commission, he means set up a team of usually German, Belgian, Swiss theologians who are not Catholic in their moral philosophy. Give them the task of work out all these obscure analytic philosophy trolley car problems where there's a rule swallowing exception. Oh, you have to murder in this one case. You have to have a slave in this one case. You have to have sex with your adulterous second civil spouse in this case. And the exception is always, it will always be this. And I want to set you up for Waldorf? Okay. It's a sin wherein Francis and his cronies figure the supply creates its own demand. So you sin once, and okay, that might not be okay. You start having sex with your concubine instead of your spouse. That's not okay. Francis will say, of course, this is not okay. And Cardinal Casper will say, of course, this is not okay. I just rewatched him on Raymond Arroyo's show in June of 2015, saying, of course, that's not okay. But then you keep having sex with your spouse, and all of a sudden they go, at a certain point, Francis and Casper go, maybe it's because they had a kid, maybe it's because of some other trolley car-like exception, where they say, okay, well, now this sin is creating its own demand for more sin, where Francis and Cardinal Casper actually figure they've tricked us all, where they can say, we found this one case where it can, we're not saying it's all cases, but we found this one case where it can actually be a sin not to commit the mortal sin of having adulterous sex with your spouse, and therefore the adulterous sex is not the mortal sin. They always think that links to, in this adulterous second civil union, having kids and the kids seeing the mom and dad argue. This is what you're going to talk about in this book that Francis wrote the preface for. He's basically saying, oh, a mom and a dad are so horny and angry that they're going to fight, maybe even to murder each other. They're just trying to do the rule proving exception. They're not fancy moral philosophers. They haven't threaded the needle, but they just blunder around. And then they're like, oh yeah, so we found it. We found the exception where they need to have sex with each other, with their concubine, or else they create a greater sin. So that's what basically Francis has christened through Amoris Laetitia, 6 months later through his Acta Apostolica Sedis, Resposta to the Argentine bishops in September 2016. And then even with this forward to this less known book that came out in 2017.
2019. No, the book was 2018.
Okay. You take it away from there. And I posted your article in the live chat, everyone who wants to look at it. It's good.
Sure. Just before getting to that, I think it's important also to recall for your audience here is that, those who have perhaps not read Familiaris Consortio 84, John Paul II, like you said, he settled the issue. Now, he doesn't use the kind of formal, infallibility language, but he does talk about the church reaffirms her practice. And then he outlines what that practice is, and that how reconciliation in the sacrament is impossible to these types of couples that we're talking about. And then after listing what the practice is, he then reiterates at the bottom of paragraph 84, he says, by acting in this way, meaning the practice, by acting in this way of not giving communion to divorced and remarried couples who are living more exurio, he's saying by acting in this way, the church professes her own fidelity to Christ and to his truth. So the act opposite to that would be to be acting against Christ's truth and not being faithful to him. And I would just also note that under John Paul II, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith replied to some of those German bishops who tried to come up with all these exceptions. And again, he said that the Familiaris Consortio was issued as binding. So even then they were told no again. And then, so you have about 2 or 3 apostolic exhortations where John Paul II says you can't do this. And there's also an apostolic exhortation where Benedict says he can't do this. So there's a whole history just within the last, 20, 30 years of this. And of course, there is the perennial teaching of the church. So this is like completely new, what Francis is proposing here. But to the specific example in Walford's book, now they're going to say this has to do with reduced culpability, or they try to justify what a firm purpose of amendment is. But it's kind of comical to read this. So I'll just read. It's not too long. So this is I'll read here. This is Walford's words now. So what exactly is the situation to which we allude? This is the exception. It would be a case where the children are born out of a civil invalid union. The couple at some stage return to the faith and seek a loving relationship with Jesus. They know and accept their union is wrong, but there is no going back. Former marriages are irreparably damaged. In this new union, they have tried hard to live as brother and sister. So here they are. This is me now. They're trying to live by Familiaris Consortio 84. Live as brother and sister. So they've tried that. And now continuing with Walford's words, but their attempts have caused a great tension and constant arguments. The husband is now fighting temptations against impurity of various kinds. The peace of the home is fragmenting and the children are being affected. No longer are the arguments kept behind closed doors, but abuse is being hurled around the room while the children play. There is a real danger of the home becoming a quasi-war zone, and possibly a family breakup is imminent. Not only have the children had to experience this, but they have also not experienced for a considerable time any affection between their parents. On the contrary, coldness has been apparent even in the good times. They are confused. What they hear preached in church is not replicated at home. The older ones are asking questions why mom and dad no longer love each other, and there is a distinct possibility they begin to see nothing beneficial in Catholicism based on their experience at home. In fact, there is a danger of blame being attributed to the faith. So this is the point where the parents make their decision here. At this point, according to Walford, the parents make the decision that living celibate lives is unworkable. They say to God, in quotes, we cannot continue like this. We don't have the strength, even though we have tried. For our children, we are now witnesses for the devil more than you. We are spreading poison, and it is ruining them. If we continue like this, we are causing greater evil, and we feel like we may turn the children away from the faith. Our conscience tells us we risk breaking the fifth commandment, so murder, and in a real sense, destroying their emotional and spiritual lives. It is our honest intention to flee from all these evils, including the sexual relationship, and we long to live lives of purity. We ask your constant forgiveness, even though our weakness means we cannot fulfill what you desire from us. We shall strive in whatever way we can to respond to your grace, knowing that your love and mercy will lead us towards salvation. As proof of our good intention, what we lack now, we will make up for in other areas, in almsgiving and fasting. So that's the end quote there. So that's Walford's example. Again, he brings us down to reduce moral culpability. He tries to bring in Aquinas, about acting under coercion, even though he says this is not under coercion, but they're acting under the constraints of the situation that you just heard, right? That the children will be harmed if they don't have sexual relations. So, okay, we'll do this for the kids so that they will be good Catholics. So, I mean, it's incredible, actually.
Yeah, so here's some heresies right in the smack dab from the beginning of what he's saying. One, that that there's an irreparable harm done to your first marriage. This is a contradiction of a couple of the different canons of Trent. So this is a needed, by the way, this is a needed precondition, a sine qua non. You see, again, don't forget the moral theologians. You need moral philosophers on the case here, Thomist action theorists. And that's what I'm bringing to the table. So you need, in order for the principle of double effect to have the conditions for the possibility of even maybe kicking in later, you need that first, the true marriage to be irreparably busted. Well, Trent says it's never irreparably busted, no matter what they did. The man can have tried to kill the woman, but the woman tried to kill the man. It's never irreparably busted because of the graces of the sacrament. So this is not, this is it's like trying to explicate a false logoi. You can't, it's a non-starter. So they said,
but plus, I think that for the double effect too, the action has to be at least morally neutral. I mean, it can't be an evil act. You can't do, you can't do evil that good may come of it. So you can't have adulterous sex for the good of your kids. I mean, so it's just incredible.
Well, it gets really complicated. You're like, so in the case of principle of double effect applied to homicide in defense of self or others, it can be a foreseeable unintended effect. And common people that haven't studied a lot of philosophy are like, well, there's no such thing as a foreseeable unintended effect. What this means is, I'm shooting this guy. I'm not intending to kill him. I'm intending to defend my own life. I'm not intending the homicide, even though it's foreseeable as I do it that it will kill him. But so it's foreseeable and unintended. That's not what's going on here. It doesn't actually mean the act of homicide isn't evil. It is ontologically evil, but it's covered because it's a foreseeable unintended effect. That's not what's happening here. Literally, now when he goes on to describe the family, this is not a family in the sense of Catholic theology or Catholic moral philosophy, right? Nowhere in the Old Testament or the New Testament can you refer to an adulterer's illegitimate second family. That, some guys have hose and area codes, right? That's not a family. Family is always understood, at least from the New Testament on, but even in the Old Testament, when you talk about Isaac and Ishmael, family means legitimate sacramental family. For this guy to live with his family, he needs to go home. See my first point above. So you can't. So they're trying to glom onto the kids and to try to kind of immanentize the eschaton, where for the kids' sakes, we really need to do it with each other. They're never going to be able to make that leap, even without these first 2 points. But the first 2 points are more devastating and cut the legs out from the argument from the very beginning, because this is not their family. The family is whatever estranged spouse, true spouse you have in God's eyes. The man needs to go home. I don't care if the woman was even a feminist. I have people that know I hate feminism will go, well, is this divorce okay? She became a feminist. I don't care. You're the idiot that married her. Go live with her, right? Go suffer with her. This is the teaching. That is your wife in God's eyes. Maybe she's worse than a feminist. Maybe she tried to kill you. Work it out. Go live with her. Or if you can't work it out and you can't live with her, live separated, but you have to be celibate. And then they'll say, but a worse evil will happen if this guy's estranged from his new family. He has no new family, right? He has an illegitimate kid with a concubine. That's not, you've created a contradiction in terms. So
exactly.
his duty is always to his wife to go live with her. JP2 did a licit rule bending for him. You can keep living with your concubine and your bastards. Fine. Okay. No one takes issue with that because that's sort of moral neutral. That's not morally contradictory, like you said, Stephen. But you need to go home. Yeah. That's the ideal situation. It can never be a sin to go home. We have canons from Trent that say this is a identifiable heresy, to say it would be a sin to do the right thing.
That's right. Yeah, that's what the direct canon from Trent. If anyone says that the commandments of God are impossible to observe, even for a man who is justified and established in grace, let him be anathema. And this couple in the example say, we can't do this. We can't live as brother and sister. So so the example itself is implicitly or explicitly denying the canon from Trent.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I butted in. I wanted you to be able to fully characterize this goofball's argument here. I just wanted to point out from an action theory, from a Thomistic point of view, this does not even begin to take flight and get off the ground. It's just nowhere near. It doesn't even have wheels or wings.
No, you're right. And how they try to explain it is the reduced moral culpability. You know, that they'll talk about intention. He talks about the firm, Walford, when he's talking about this example, talks about a firm purpose of commitment. How can you have a firm purpose of commitment like this in a situation like this? And he says it goes to the intention, where most moral theologians would say, well, the intention is you got to stop. You can't continue. But he's saying, no, the intention here is that they plan to at some point stop. So that's that he's saying. He's like giving that's sincere for them that they do want to stop at some point, just not now, because of these constraints that they're operating under. So it's reduced moral culpability. So it's probably a venial sin at most, is what he's suggesting. But when you look at Aquinas, and that's the thing too. I mean, I know you've seen it before, and you might have talked about it on your last show, or when you talked about Amoris Laetitia before. They try to make it sound like it's very Thomistic, but I mean, Thomas on the question of adultery, right? I think it's an example that the Dubia cardinals used. I think for one of their first set of dubias, that you cannot commit adultery for any reason, even if it's to save the kingdom. So there's no good intention that would justify adultery ever. But here they're going against Thomas, so against their purported claim that they're being very Thomistic.
Yeah, and again, I didn't want to get overly technical, but so in Thomistic action theory, people have to understand this all gets quite technical. One intends ends and deliberates upon means. You intend ends and deliberate upon means. And in Thomas, it would be the night in which all cows are black, to use a Hegelian expression, or a circular square, to express that these people are intending to be celibate as they say, okay, let's go and have sex. So when you say, well, we're intending the end of celibacy by having sex, and we're deliberating upon means of eventually getting there. That's not how it works. All of these terms are specifically laid out. You have something called a materia circa quam. Each act is its own morally discrete creature. Each act. So it's impossible to say we intend to be celibate with this act of sexual intercourse. That's like saying, I intend to stay dry by jumping into the pool. And I want to point out there that all this is really specific in Thomas. It's also doesn't need to be that specifically like adumbrated, because people out there see how stupid it is. But I do think they need to know that what you're saying, Stephen, and what I'm saying can be articulated in far more devastating specific ways. It doesn't make for a great podcast, but I wanted you to read from a certain, did you read the whole section from Walford where
I did that. I read that. That's his whole. That's the example. Now, of course, he kind of sets it up, talking about intention, and then afterwards talking about trying to appeal to Aquinas, what he says about coercion or constraint with regard to actions and sin, to kind of say that, hey, this is reduced moral culpability. So essentially it's a venial sin, that they have their intention is right and true, that they do want to, like I said, purify their lives eventually, help me, Lord, but not now, basically.
Yeah, they say, okay, in your article you cite on 1 Peter 5, which I furnished for everyone there. This is really a well thought through piece here. So I appreciate having access to it. He says, at this point, the parents make the decision that living celibate lives is unworkable. They say to God, we can't continue like this. We don't have the strength, even though we have tried. And they make a decision now to intend the opposite act, right? When you're again, I don't want to do a whole action theory thing, but intent is when you have the moral philosophers, and I've studied under some of the most famous action theorists in the world, or action theorists adjacents, like Father Kevin L. Flannery, Stephen Jensen. I'm just telling you, you guys, you have to understand, it's pure bullshit to dress this up as anything Catholic, anything Thomistic. It's absolutely wrong to say that they can make a decision. We were trying to be celibate. Now we're making the decision to not be celibate. We're gonna go have sex. And yet to be intending through their act of sex, remember, they're doing all the incipient acts that go to having sex, taking off their clothes, making jokes, talking dirty, whatever they're doing, and they're still intending to be celibate. That's simply not how Thomistic moral epistemology functions. It's a contradiction in terms. And yes, you pointed out really nicely that they're contravening on the at least one or two of the canons of Trent. They are anathema. This is anathema to say we don't have the strength for it. But
that's right.
Yeah, go ahead.
And the setup for the purpose of the article originally was, like I said, if you recall that open letter by, I think it was like 45 theologians. I think it came out Easter week of 2019, where they accused Francis of the delict of heresy. And they list, a number of propositions that they believe that, or evidence, propositions under which they have evidence or presented evidence that he would did err against, and different types of evidence. And I was just surprised when I looked through that no one had really plopped this thing in there too, because I think it would be evidence that he supported the example in this book, which I think is obviously, as we're talking about, has heretical ideas or heretical praxis in here. I don't know how you qualify it, but clearly, if you look at, and that's what I tried to do in the article, is take the 7 propositions that the open letter lays out, and then kind of show how that Walford's example kind of falls underneath these. I'll just give one example here, is that one of their propositions, which they say is heretical, a person is able, while he obeys a divine prohibition, to sin. A person is able, while he obeys a divine prohibition, to sin against God by the very act of obedience. So, and that's what this couple is saying. If we don't have sex, we're going to be frustrated. We'll be yelling at each other, and the kids will suffer. So, doing good is really an act of disobedience. So, it's just incredible where this example has led.
Yeah. So that, look, this is all good specifics. Francis wrote the preface for the book, and he wrote, I hope your book will help many. You know, he might have written this preface before the book was published, but
no, but he got the approval. He got the approval. Walford got his approval to put it in there, so it was
right.
And he's close to Tornielli, so I would think. And the funny thing is too, I try to give some. I wouldn't say cover to Francis, but just to leave open the possibility. Well, maybe you can't blame him because he wrote this before that. But then the funny thing is, though, then Pope splainers. Pedro Gabriel wrote a book called The Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia, and he quotes he footnotes me saying that, well, he wrote this before the book, but he says no, he would not have, I get the exact wording, but he was basically saying, no, this is a kind of a confirmation of Walford's interpretation of Amoris Laetitia. So,
but hold it, back up. We don't need the Walford example is case in point, and I love it because this is the only example that that we could fabricate. The only test case where we could instantiate one member of one adulterous second union anywhere on earth where there could even be a provable try at they're not gonna live according to Familiaris Consortio 84, right? That it's not just that they're living together, they're living together, they want communion, but they want to have sex with someone besides their spouse. This is the only case anyone could divine or fathom. It has to be, okay, we're going to be really sexually frustrated, we're going to be horny, and we're going to start fighting in front of our kids. Maybe the fights will be so bad that we fight in front of our kid. It's like you're choosing to sin, and you're layering upon it more sin, and you're layering upon it more sin, such that you think at some point all of those sins will be licit. This is what I was saying before about the sin layered upon sin. Casper and Francis will go, that's fine, that's fine, that's fine, until a certain point they go, okay, now it justified all of it. That this is the only example that Walford gives that could be divined. Like when moral philosophers do these analytic trolley car problems, the trolley car problem is the train track where you throw a switch to kill one to save others. And it's infamous. It's like an inside joke among analytic moral philosophers, because you could the moral situation can change on a seemingly very, very small modification to where you throw the switch, right? Because of the principle of double effect, because of what is required by intending ends, deliberating upon means. So it's something of a meme in itself, the trolley car problem, but this isn't close anywhere to satisfying what would be requisite for the principle of double effect to kick in, where you can in one sense do a wrong. It's not close, but all I want to do is bring the parish orphans and retrogrades back to Amoris Laetitia, because I had clarity after I read it. I read in 2 days ago's show. I knew exactly what he was saying. He expressed it. He expressed it in the body in 1 or 2 places, and in the footnote in 2 or 3 places. He's saying that with the precondition for the exhortation being, we're not talking about remarried divorcees with a kid who want to just keep living together Josephite. We're talking about people that want to have sex with their adulterous second union and still go get communion. So he's saying they have to have access to the sacraments. And then when the Buenos Aires bishops say, well, the only 2 sacraments that he could be talking about are communion and confession, but how do you go to confession and confess a sin when you plan to continue doing it? They apply it and they say, we're going to let people in our diocese, at least some of them, who are civilly remarried adulterers have sex with each other and get communion, Francis says you have the only interpretation that's correct. It's in hard brackets. That's correct. Since these words, or since concrete situations are predicated of these universal words, universally applicable words, we have to search then for concrete behaviors where this could be carried out. And the only concrete behaviors where it could be carried out is the situation that that Waldorf applies here. So that's Walford. Yeah, I'm going Waldron. There are some Waldorf, Walford.
Waldo, yeah.
Yeah, Waldo. So we don't need this many specifics. They're helpful, but there's no other situation because of familiaris consortio. You must understand, careful listeners. Because of familiaris consortio, we've already sort of bracketed out all the other situations. We're talking about two adulterers who want sex with each other. That's what the whole 2014-2015 synods were about. And they start out saying, well, of course, this is adultery. It's wrong. Casper starts out every speech on this. He started out the speech he gave before the 2014 synod on this. Of course, it's wrong. They're the but philosophers. They say, but we need to study for these trolley car test cases. And they thought they came up with it. And it would be like one human being who's ever lived anyway, if they even came up with the one example of a trolley car problem that worked out. But they didn't even do that. They used the wrong moral reasoning even here, which you make really clear in your article, Stephen.
The funny thing too about this example is just how bold it is. Here you have two parties that are potentially willing to cooperate with each other. Most of the other examples, I think all the other examples I've seen, are usually the case where, there's a single mom or her husband, left, the Catholic husband left her. She's all alone. She might have a couple of kids. She marries another guy. They have some kids, and then she decides to come back to the faith. And now she has these moral qualms now that she's living in a irregular, relationship. But she's afraid, if she leaves, that she'll be cut off from financial help, or he might take the kids. Those are the types of sob stories they try to create to kind of say this has been an example. So that's why I was just really surprised to see Walford's example, where it's just you have two spouses who are willing to cooperate with each other. They were actually following familiaris consortio before they decided not to. So it's really incredible.
So Walford's example is not the diminished capacity example. He at times he's just a really poor thinker. He crosses it up. He's saying that this would actually be morally justifiable because of his absolutely pedestrian understanding of intent, his non-action theory, non-Thomistic understanding of what intent is. He thinks this is actually justifiable. He's not making the diminished capacity argument. The diminished capacity argument that I think Francis is actually intoned is the one you just listed. That would be the case for, well, it's still grave matter objectively, but in this case, a remarried mom who's had illegitimate kids with her concubine, she gets a threat from a non-Catholic spouse, just the way you laid out. I'm glad you remind me of this, Stephen. And he's going to leave. He's going to leave her if she doesn't have sex with him because he's not Catholic. She's reverted back to the faith. Francis tries out two theories here. Francis Casper. They try out two theories. One, to actually morally justify it, and saying they're just throwing spaghetti at a wall. They don't even have a concrete moral or legal theory on this thing. The first is, well, isn't this justified? Because isn't this a case where a worse evil would happen if a family was broken up? Again, I've already addressed that. It's not a family. Her family is her spouse. It's always morally incumbent on a divorcee to, if you can, go reconcile. If you can't reconcile, you just live Josephite on your own. But Francis gives the second try a theory which would enable her to have sex with this adulterous sex. And that would be the diminished capacity argument. Well, she's being threatened by him. Does this attenuate her ability, her culpable mens rea, her frame of mind, which would be requisite to mortal sin? And this is essentially the same weak try that defenders of abortive mothers will try. Like, well, if anyone in their life said, hey, maybe you should have this abortion, you can't go be an actress or a singer or whatever if you have the baby, they'll try to say that this attenuates on the subjective side of sin, your culpability, such that maybe it's not sin. No, the response to this, the church has always given, is a simple one. The church has always affirmed the subjective moral standard is very, very high, right? It's up there next to like fraud in the inducement. The defense is against the contract. Fraud in the inducement. If someone lied to you, if someone did drug you, or if someone threatened imminent harm against your person. These are the examples the church has always used for what constitutes diminished capacity sufficient to attenuate your culpable mens rea, such that you can do something really, really grave like murder or rape or adulterous sex. And this is not the case. All her concubine is doing is he's being a concubine, and he's saying, hey, we're not a family. You know, we might have had a kid together, but you have another spouse. This guy probably has another spouse somewhere. I'm going to take off. So really, this isn't, at the end of the day, distinguishable from Francis's first moral theory, where he says, doesn't this kind of justify her action? Well, no, not strictly speaking. All he's saying in the second case is, doesn't it justify her breaking out into a cold sweat? Doesn't it attenuate her subjective mens rea enough that it's not moral sin? Probably not, unless she's like partly crazy or something, because, you know, modern women will just say, oh, okay, well, this was a risk anyway. It was a foreseeable risk. Concubine's concubine. And this is all about sex anyway. It was about sex. That's why I got together with this new guy who's not my husband. And this might be my kid, but he's an illegitimate kid. So the church has always answered, no, you don't get to go kill your enemy and just say, well, I don't know. Dr. Dre told Eminem, hey, if you ever want to kill Kim, I'll show you where the ocean is. So he pushed me into it. That doesn't work. It doesn't work. And the church has always been clear that doesn't work. So no. This is material heresy.
Well, that brings us back, I guess, to Mueller and his recent disappearing article comments. So I LifeSite News took him down, I think, within 24 hours, probably because I don't know if he was speaking on background or he just had second thoughts upon seeing it. But what he said, though, about Francis, uttering lots of material heresy, and I think he referred to heresy in practice, which of course would just be giving communion to the divorced and remarried. But he had responded, and we're speaking, I think, pre-show about this, that he had actually responded to with an open letter, I think in early October, to some dubia responses that a Cardinal Duca received. He had Cardinal Duca, I think he's from Czechoslovakia, submitted 10 dubia, kind of Amoris Laetitia related, about giving communion to a divorced and remarried. And then Fernandez responded, and it had signature from Francis on it. And Mueller was pretty straight in his open letter. He says, I'm just quoting, I found the quote here. So the response was called the Risposta, because I think it might have come in Spanish, or I think it might have been Italian. But this is Mueller's words. But the difficulty with the teaching of the Risposta and the text of Buenos Aires, those are the guidelines you're referring to, Tim, is not only the discontinuity with the teaching of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, for it happens that the teaching of the Risposta is contrary to other teachings of the church, which are not only affirmations of the ordinary magisterium, but have been taught in a definitive way as belonging to the deposit of the faith. And again, I think it might have been in the 1 Peter 5 article. I think he said this, he's really pointing the finger at Fernandez, because I guess he's saying he's more responsible for the Risposta. or for the Resposta, saying that that is close to being formal heresy. I think that's the quote from the article that showed up now, I think in 1 Peter 5.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is, that quote is still up there in 1 Peter 5. It's no longer on LifeSite News where it was originally posted. But
Yeah, I mean,
I'd never seen. You go ahead. Sorry.
No, and then he talks about Mueller. This must be from LifeSite News. This is on 1 Peter 5, quoting from them. Mueller argued that through Francis's implicit promotion and toleration of same-sex blessings and Holy Communion for divorced and civilly remarried, the Pope is fostering a heresy of practice. So, you get to technical definitions of what's formal heresy, canonically, formal heresy, and then material heresy. I mean, certainly a low bar case is, I think, for favoring heresy, kind of falling into the Pope Honorius category, who actually didn't teach heresy. I think a lot of people mistakenly say he taught heresy.
They do.
They do. Is that he favored it without promoting it, but by his kind of incompetence, favored the heresy.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I think Honorius proves the chronological bias that Pope splainers have, right? They when they say, "Oh, I'm just faithful to the Pope," no, you're not. You're trying to throw Honorius to make Francis seem less bad, to trivialize the degree of his material heresy. Says I, and says Cardinal Mueller. You're trying to throw Honorius under the bus in a way that's undue. We have never had a Pope like Francis. It doesn't mean that they love the papacy any more than you or I do, Stephen. All it means is that they think that they're modernists. The present is always better than the past. They think it's okay later to unduly throw someone like Honorius under the bus. He kind of blundered into allowing heresy. He did not teach heresy. Francis has taught material heresy in so many places. We haven't even covered all of them today. I do a show called 101 Outrages of Francis. A bunch of those are material heresies. And he's actively advocating them, and is, part of the crew that has been actively advocating them since the early to middle 90s, when I think it's 1996 is the first time I've ever read any of the Sankt Gallen heretics. And again, most of the Sankt Gallen guys from Northern Europe don't even believe Jesus resurrected from the dead. They said there's one guy radical enough for us, one guy, and he's this Argentine, and his name is Jorge Bergoglio. I think the earliest I've seen them say that is 96. So let's put this in perspective. Casper begins saying, we don't give a shit about remarried divorcees or their illegitimate children. We're just trying to make their sin okay. So it's love the sin, hate the sinner, actually. Yeah. They're just trying to make the sex sins okay. JP2 solved this 12 years ago, where you can, leave the gun, take the cannoli. Let them keep living with their adulterous second spouse, but you're not allowed to have the sex and get communion. Let's try to figure ways, study commission, trolley car, moral philosophy problem ways where we can come up with that. They didn't really do it. They didn't even come with one instance in the world where it works out. But they're like, that's good enough. Let's just run with that. That started in 93, that Casper began doing that. In 96, remember, Cardinal Walter Brandmuller said the second year of this pontificate, this is how the agenda is going to work. First, it'll be this long-running Casper plan, which is now 30 years old. Actually, it's 51 years old. The first publisher of some version of the Casper plan was from 1972. I'll let you guys guess while I'm talking who came out with that. Communion for the divorced and civilly remarried. Guess. And I will kiss a pig or something like that. But
I think it's important to remember too is that I think it was Marco Tassati or maybe Sandro Magister. He had written that there is evidence that Francis, as Cardinal Bergoglio or Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, was allowing his priest to give communion to the divorced and remarried or
Yep.
living adulterous situation. So
I remember.
it was going on. So I mean, I forget. I think he became archbishop in the 80s. Maybe it was early 90s. So the thing is when like Walford in his book tries to appeal to tradition and all that, but or to Cardinal Newman on doctrinal development. Well, the doctrinal development here is really one bred in disobedience, because you had John Paul II's teaching on the book. So technically, he's acting. I guess technically you could say it was an active schism to actually do this.
Yep.
So and then Casper, as you've been saying, they've been fighting this thing all along. So they've been the dissenters all along from a solid teaching going back, or perennial, but also reaffirmed by John Paul II in this is 83, whenever Familiaris Consortio came out.
81.
Okay.
Yeah, and by the way, Stephen, do you know who first came up with communion for the divorced and civilly remarried in 1972 in a paper?
Oh, well, actually, it'd be I think Ratzinger.
Yeah, it's Ratzinger. It's Ratzinger.
Do I get a T-shirt or something for?
Yeah. You get why I said I jumped the pig. It's Ratzinger. Good man. Ratzinger is the Professor Snape of Catholic conservatives, right? Once a committed Death Eater, he came over to our side allegedly, and yet goes back and forth between both sides. And then his last act is still really an unjustifiable act of the Death Eaters that maybe some think was justifiable. I call him Professor Snape here. Communion for the divorced and civilly remarried.
But he did, but Ratzinger did issue an apologia for that. He did retract his statement. I think when they redid his papers, I think he removed that one or something. Like he made some sort of retraction on that. But still, the
Professor Snape. Yeah.
Others will still the kind of the Pope explainers will still kind of cite the earlier work against the kind of the later version of Ratzinger and Benedict.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Catholics are a lot more with our leaders. This is a big theme, I think, with the Pope's planning. Catholics are a lot more forgiving than I am. See, I believe with leadership, I believe Jesus, that with leadership, with great power comes great responsibility. When you're in charge, everything's your fault. Everywhere else in the world, aside from the Catholic hierarchy, everyone knows this is true. Jesus affirms it's true with stumbling blocks. It's one thing if you're just not important and you could speak more freely. But if you're in charge and you cause even one person to fall away, think of how condemning this is for Pope Francis. If you cause even one of these little ones to stumble and lose their faith, it'll be better that you were never born and all that, the cinder block tied around your neck and you're tossed into the sea, all that stuff that Jesus says directly. Catholics really tend to ignore that. And they do so a lot with Ratzinger too. Like if you read any of the guy's writings from the 70s, it's like, whew, I mean, this is a stink fest. And then he really was with all of those guys when he was a Ronnerite. And even in his last will and testament with who published that?
Seawald.
Seawald, yeah. He says, we did all this bad, non-Catholic theology, particularly morally theology, just because we're sick of Thomas and the Neo-Thomists out of the manualist tradition. We're bored. And he says it in a way where he's really kind of justifying it. You want to see something new. And you're like, wow, this is flippant. And this is why you helped to destroy the church, Cardinal Ratzinger. So I don't take the same view that many Catholics do of our high-ranking prelates up to and including the Pope. I think what the world thinks, that with great power comes great responsibility. Not with great power should come smoke screens and you get to get away with more because you're in a high position. That does seem to be the new Catholic way. Have you noticed this, Steve, that Francis, after the Summer of Shame, the misbehaviors are really what did it for people 18, 19, 20. Like, wow, people were really sick of it. It had taken them too long to see with Francis how bad he was. But then during COVID, 21, 22, 23, they Francis has only gotten worse, and the mask has come completely off in those years. But
Well,
they
there's a famous. I think it was Fernandez who had. I think it was Fernandez who had said it, and it was quoted early in the pontificate. You probably remember it. It said something that, alluding to Francis maybe having a plan that if he sensed his time was short, he would, speed things up, the pace of change. It was something, I'm not quoting it properly, but that was the sense of it. And I think that's what we're seeing now, right? I mean, he allowed Mueller to stay on at CDF, so we had some relative protection there. Then Ladaria, for all his weaknesses, right? I guess I don't think Francis would have allowed a lot of these dubia to have been answered underneath him. But now that he has his man at the DDF now, we're going to start seeing more of that. And that's the scary thing. And that's why I do think that you see that the frustration, I think, with what Mueller said, because he really was a liberal moderate going back. He used to defend liberation theology. So for him to kind of be coming out like this, like he didn't sign the original dubia. Granted, he was at the CDF, but I think what we're going to see now is I think they're at a cafe in Rome scratching their heads, what do we do? But I think they realize they might have to do something, because the pace of change and then the gravity of these changes, like I said, the recent dubia with the ABC, I don't know if you're allowed to say it on YouTube, whatever, but what I'm talking about, that group. So that, I mean, I'm sure the Pope's planners will look at that and say, well, if you read it this way, it's really in concert with past practice. And, I haven't looked at it closely. Maybe you can make that argument, but that the other side is not going to look at it that way. They're going to operate in that area of ambiguity and grayness. And that's where you get into favoring heresy. And that's why a lot of these dubias and policies are so pernicious. And
and that's really important. What I was pointing out about the phenomenon of 21, 22, 23 is the more Francis is accelerated, 18, 19, 20 people were willing to admit Francis is bad. Those same people in 21, 22, 23, as Francis has accelerated and gotten worse, they've gone back toward Pope-splaining. That's really what I noticed during mid-COVID. It was very, very trendy. I think every once in a while, the right thing becomes trendy. It's rare, but in 18, 19, TNT was going strong. It was really popular to criticize Pope Francis. And I was like, I've been waiting for this since his second month in the chair. But then he's only gotten worse since then. So the critique should have increased at least linearly, right? If not like asymptotically. But it hasn't. The critique went like this. And now it's kind of trendy to say like, no, the Pope doesn't mean that. And all of a sudden you're blaming everyone. You're blaming everyone for just saying, here's this canon of Trent.
Yeah, well, the Pope's players have double down, triple down. I just wish that they would plant a flag somewhere and say, well, I won't go beyond this.
Right.
I think if you see a lot of these things going on today, and if you ask them, 3 years ago, no, that will never happen. And I'd like to go back one day. I mean, he blocked me, Michael Lewis, from where Peter is, but I seem to recall, and I forgive me if I'm wrong, Mr. Lewis, if you're out there, but I seem to recall that he had some concerns about the German synodal way back when on Twitter. But now I think they've kind of warmed up to that, and obviously you're seeing that in the Roman Synod, those types of things percolating along. So it's kind of curious that they're moving along. They're like lobster. They're truly like lobsters in a pot. They're going along happily with being boiled.
But that's a really important point. We could. I wanted to ask you one other question about Cardinal Scola. You mentioned it. I don't mind if you take a long closing to unpack that. But as we close your excellent article up, I do want to speak to some people out there, the pearl clutching charitable mob that say, how do you know, Tim, that Pope-splainers are actually, that at least a good portion of them are liars and not just naive? The only way that when someone's wrong, you never know whether they're lying or they're just mistaken. Of course, this is it's a verification problem epistemically. The way I know with some of the Pope-splainers, I'm not going to name names here, but some of the Pope-splainers that I'm talking about are my my own friends. And I'm talking to public pope splainers, private pope splainers. Some of my friends, you know who they are, some you don't. I'm talking about conversations that I had in 2015, 2016, 2017 with dear friends, where I was saying, well, what's going to happen at this family synod? And they said he's going to shut it down. He'll never. And I said in 2014 and 2015, here's what he's going to do. He's going to do something sneaky that has to get you have codified heteropraxy, where you have to interpret it, and it'll be incrementally interpreted into a solidified heretical position, exactly like what we had. I called this one. I just didn't have a show back then. So I didn't record myself saying it. And they said, that's never going to happen. Francis is listening to Cardinal Casper at 2014, 2015. He's making everyone listen to him. And I'd say, why is he going to do that if this is an open and shut case? Saying he just wants to have him heard out, and he's going to knock him back. And the exhortation that comes out in 2016 is going to destroy it. I'm thinking of one of my friends out there. He knows who he is. He's not altogether a private man. And he said, watch, you'll see. And then 2016, it came out, and I was like, so I'm right. And for a period of 2016, 2017, 2018, this friend was like, wow, Tim, you called it. I mean, literally, we were debating for a year, 2014, 2015. Then 2015, 2016, 2017, he's like, you called it. And then, like I say, 2019, 2020, 2021, he just flipped back and started denying that he ever admitted, oh, wow, you really called Francis. And he started onboarding the cope of the modern pope splainers, which was not the same justification ex ante that he'd given about Francis. He said Francis will just knock it down. He didn't say the pope splainers cope that, oh, well, yes, Francis allowed it, but it's justifiable because of diminished capacity, which is what the pope splainers are left with now. So that's what we call philosophical residuum. They trade. A lot of them did this too, not just my one buddy I'm thinking of. Blessed ginger buddy. You watch their arguments change. Those are the people, you know, whether they know it or not, that they're actually being dishonest. So that is how I know. I'm not just saying, oh, they're mistaken, they must be lying. Some people are mistaken because they can't reason stuff through. That's mistake. That's a mistake of Sheehan-Ter. But a mistake and a planned mistake, that's actual dishonesty. And I have friends that have done this. They've literally changed the way their cope has shaped. And there have been admissions of wrong. Tim, you were right. I was wrong in there. And then they move away from that. That's an admission of dishonesty. Anyway, you had, just because, you haven't been on the show in a while, we've talked behind the scenes about the election in 2013 at the conclave, Stephen. And I was one of the rare guys. I was at an oil and gas job, clicking refresh on the Wikipedia pontificate page or something. And for a while, it declared Angelo Scola, a member of Communion at Liberazione, and known as a conservative, as Pope. And then it undid it. And then a half hour later, we got Francis. And so we've talked about Scola a few times, you and I. Do you mind saying what you included in your email to me? I love it.
Yeah, sure. Well, on my blog, I have a collection of articles called the Conclave Chronicles. Even though I do believe, putatively at least, that Francis is Pope, and more likely than not, I have looked open-mindedly at all the theories, including Benny Papism. In fact, I have a book against or defending the validity of Benedict's resignation. I mean, I wish I could say otherwise, but I also looked at the election, the various controversies, the campaigning, and so forth, trying to find evidence that it's invalid. So clearly there are a lot of curious, very puzzling things, and that's what we talked that I talked about on your show maybe a couple of years ago. But one of the things we did not get to was this really odd case of Scola. Is that, I mean, an argument could be made that probably that Benedict resigned thinking he could resign happily, thinking that Scola would more likely than not be elected Pope. He was the odds-on favorite by the bookies to win. But we know that the St. Gallimafi did not like Scola. So we know that going into this particular story. So So, but what happened to Scola? Because you had the Italian press, they had counted up his votes or had projected that he'd get, 70, 77 votes, whatever the election thing was, or how close he was to being elected. And then, he faded, as he said. Why was that? There was that weird press account. I don't go into that in this article, two-part article. But what I did find, it's public, not find, it's public knowledge, is that on the morning of the conclave, so the conclave started on March 2nd, the cardinals would process into the Sistine Chapel, I think after Mass, or to go to Mass. I think they started at 4:30 to process in, so 4:30 in the afternoon. That morning, there was a pre-dawn raid on the offices of an Italian politician. His name was Roberto Formigoni. And he was a close friend of Scola. And of course, the raid had nothing to do with Scola. Scola wasn't accused of corruption and all that. But Formigoni was associated with this Catholic lay association. You might be familiar with Comunione e Liberazione, or CL.
Scola's associated with them too.
Scola's associated with it, where he was for a time, but it's had some controversy, probably on the progressive side in the church, where they kind of saw it as being involved in corruption, or some members like Formigoni allegedly being involved in corruption. But there was this police raid, pre-dawn raid on the morning you're going to the conclave, and then you get all these press reports start coming out. It made it into, I always thought it was odd too, it showed up in the English press. The Italian press were quoting the English press that morning. So that's kind of odd that who tipped off. It's kind of like the international English press, which coincidentally are the ones that are the papers that probably the non-Italian cardinals are probably reading. But the articles were, pretty kind of linked Scola somehow to Formigoni, kind of playing up in that, say this kind of hurts his chances of being elected now. For example, this is from the Guardian. Says, find a spot, but Scola's candidacy has been overshadowed by his past links to a movement that's the CL. But Scola's candidacy has been overshadowed by his past links to a movement that has been linked with the pervasive sleaze in Lombardy. Well, that's where the police raids were. And then even I think the Atlantic called it is this an October surprise? And that's what I used that in my article as being the title for it. As folks know, right, an October surprise is kind of that last minute press release or news item that gets discovered that might sink a candidacy of someone, that you don't have time to recover. So going into the conclave, and my article has a lot of the quotes from the article, from these various articles, talking about the mafia, throwing out these inflammatory words and linking Scola to the CL, that you can see that it struck me as an appearance of, especially like now, when you think about what's happening with Trump in the legal cases, that this was like a hit job on Scola. Not that there was any reality to any of this, but just the impression going into the conclave would hurt him. And one of the Wall Street Journal articles that came out the 12th or the 13th, that talked about someone that interviewed a cardinal said, "Oh yeah, going into the conclave, I'll be talking a lot about Comunione Liberazione." That's the Scola thing, and their corruption. So it does look like there might have been you could see that there was a hit job done, but then you would have had to get the Italian prosecutors in the Milan and Lombardy areas to get involved in that. So who would have the pull to do that? So that's kind of like the premise of my two articles on it.
Oh yeah, and of course if people after Beer Bug, if people don't know, this is how the world works, right? Elections, inside and outside of the church, are all. I don't say this that often because I just figure that my audience is smart enough to know, like, pretty much everything's fake, and that's what we figured out during the Beer Bug, is that everything's pre-planned. It's a very small group of people that pre-plan everything, and that the St. Gallen Mafia, who brag about this openly, Cardinal Daniels, who have ties to the Obamas, the Podestas, and of course that just means that they're tied to the WEF and all the groups that are getting closer and closer to the true center of power. That everything's pre-planned. So I don't know who's going to be the next pope, but it's pre-planned, right? I don't all of Francis's cardinals he's brought up pre-planned. Francis spends most of his time dealing with UN globalist types, WEF, Agenda 2030. It has Francis arguably as its point man. So I'm no longer surprised by this stuff, but I was surprised in 2013 that Angelo Scola was announced as Pope and then was unannounced. How did that? And I do remember this story, Stephen. But how did that? Do you have any theories for how that happened? That he was announced?
Yeah. Well, okay. So I tend to think not everything is a conspiracy, but some things are. But I think my sense there is because I've seen like Gerard O'Connell in his book. He talks about how the he gets his and he has good sources. I mean, he's close to he's a buddy of Francis. And he talks about how I think I talk about some of it in the in my second part of this article. Talks about how the votes kind of went for Scola within the actual conclave. So my theory would be, my working theory would be that probably what happened is a lot of times you'll get news organizations will kind of write a headline, so they're ready to press the button and be the first, out of the gate, so they might pre-write an article. Maybe someone hit it, beforehand. You'll see that sometimes they'll even write up obituaries on people, some famous star, and it accidentally gets out, even though they're kind of saving it for the day that person dies. So that's kind of like what I think probably happened there. I doubt that they had there was no smoke or anything like that. There's no way they could have known it. So I think it was just a kind of an accident, But this other stuff is weird. Like I said, I was just looking at one of the articles in the Italian one of the kind of like the sub headline. It's kind of a lengthy one, but the last part of it says, "Is this a last message to the papal electors?" So even there, they were seeing it. Is this message? Is this raid a message? I mean, the raid would be to cause all these news articles the morning the cardinals were going into the conclave. This would be like the last stuff they knew going in. So it wouldn't really give Scola a chance to say, hey, well, wait a second, this is baloney. Or for them to have follow-up articles. So that to me, it's very suspicious there.
I don't think they have internet. I don't think the Cardinals have internet in
no. Oh, this was in 2013. So, but you have international papers, newsstands and all that. So they would have had access to English language papers, and certainly they could spread the news word of mouth, those who knew. I mean, again, I think it's very odd that the Guardian in England was one of the first ones who had news of this pre-dawn raid. That's pretty strange to me.
Yeah. I tend to think more, maybe a little more radically. I think pretty much everything's fake now. That doesn't really mean it's all fake. It's all pre-planned, and so I probably make a little bit more of that Scola announcement. I haven't thought much about it in the last 5 years, though. I thought about it more in terms of, oh, great, we got a South American Jesuit instead of Scola. Scola is the guy I was actually polling for, and I was hoping for. So I was overjoyed when I was sitting in my cubicle there, and I came up with he's the number 266. I haven't thought about it really a lot in the context of Francis, invalidate, any of that. I just remember those first couple years of the Francis pontificate. I was like, this sucks. We got the South American Jesuit, sleazy. He's saying sleazy South American Jesuit things. I studied with enough of these guys at the Greg to know they don't believe Catholic stuff. And he's saying, Catholics shouldn't reproduce like rabbits. One of the first things he's saying, we've talked too much about abortion. That was right out of the gate. Little did I even know he brought out Cardinal Daniels, who would kind of tell on him 3 years later, 2.5 years later, onto the loggia. And I didn't know who Cardinal Daniels was at the time. I just knew this was a sleazy choice, and Scola would have been much better. But I haven't.
I had friends in the Jesuits who said, "Watch out," So early on, I had a bad sinking feeling about this.
I've talked to Pat Coffin about this many times. I'm not. Sometimes I can be an intuitive person. Actually, I won't say I'm not. It's sort of macho to say I'm not in touch with it. I do get tinged every once in a while, but this one wasn't even so much intuition. This was just, well, he's from South America. He's a Jesuit. We're not really supposed to have a Jesuit pope, and it's really bad. And he said, "Pray for me." And then immediately just started. And I was still sore over the Scola thing. You know, I was like, oh, we got our guy. That's cool. Communion and liberation, which isn't liberal. Sounds kind of liberal.
That's another article you maybe check out. On my one of the first. And this was suggested to me by Jesuit contacts. I wrote an article. Maybe when we met, I might have mentioned it to you that one of the first series I looked at for invalidating the election potentially would be the Jesuit vows. But you're obviously, it sounds like you're aware of them, about not ambitioning for higher office or accepting it unless they were ordered to. So one theory might be that whereas his election was valid, his acceptance was invalid. So I have an article on that. I think the more I looked into it, you read a lot of the comments that the early Jesuits were saying after his election. A lot of them were like quite surprised that he was elected, say, oh, he must have had a strong calling or something. And so it's just very odd. I did talk to a canon lawyer about it. He says, well, but for X, Y, and Z reasons, probably not. But I could see reasons to argue against that one. But that one would overcome universal acceptance if you had a future pope say no, he couldn't accept, because that would have been just that could not be healed at the root if a future pope were to say that applies.
Right. What do you make of, well, usually the universal acceptance thing? Our magisterium is in such a it's funny when people try to take it too seriously, because it's a developing magisterium. We've never had a Francis, and we're going to have to go back, and we're going to have to work just to justify how this all works out. That's all I'm telling people. I'm with you. More than 50%, I do think he's the Pope, but that means a lot more work. People that try to take the magisterium really like inerrantly infallibly, it's not usually inerrant or infallible. I have someone asking in the comments, is after all the many words we've said, Stephen, has Francis taught heresy in his magisterium? It's like this is what the whole show is about. For one thing, a pope doesn't have his own magisterium, but he stuck material heresy, a letter to the Argentine bishops, into the Acte Apostolica Sedis, which is, as close to a current living, non-ratified by decades or centuries magisterium that there can be. But popes do not have their own magisterium, which I've also said many times. But yeah, the whole show has been about material heresy coming from Francis. Do you think, what do you make of, Steve, while I have you, because I am on your side. I do think Francis is Pope a little more than 50-50. You might be more convinced than me. But what do you make of the claim? This is an interesting one. That Austin Ivory made in the first edition of his book, that the Sankt Gallen goons approached Francis with, hey, would you be ready if the time comes, speaking of the Jesuit vow, to accept our canvassing? And Austin Ivory, in the first edition of his book, said that Francis said, yes, I will. And then they pulled the book off the shelves in the first week because of that. And he pulled that part out. And the fact that this had been a late sententiae excommunication by JP2. How do we get around that?
Well, I mean, obviously there was planning. I mean, the story that somehow he was like, "Oh, me be Pope," I mean, that clearly didn't happen. And you read Henry Sira's book, right? And he said he was plotting like mad, I guess, according to his sources. And of course, you have things like the Ibere thing. My view on that is that I mean, I wish it did unpope him. I mean, that'd be great. But the way I would look at it is, or at least I can see a counter argument being that, look, simony is obviously late sententia excommunication too. But the conclave rules of John Paul II explicitly do not invalidate a conclave because of simony. So if you can be a pope, bribe your way to be a pope, and that's okay. Not that it's okay, but if you can do that and it's not invalid, then really campaigning is really simony, is doing simony without the money or without the benefices and all the other stuff that might go with it, right? I mean, it's kind of the same idea. So I don't see if you can say, you can be pope if you bribe your way to it and have those types of discussions. But if you don't have the money and have discussions, you're not pope. That just logically doesn't fit for me. Maybe there's some canon lawyer out there who say, Steve, and I wish there were, because I think there is strong evidence that he came in, obviously plotting himself. I mean, I think we talked about it last time, and he met with Tornielli and some journalists the day before Benedict's resignation. That's the first people he met with were journalists, and then like 2 days afterwards, Tornielli writes a glowing article about him, about his potential candidacy to kind of kick off things. So I mean, there's a lot of odd things that happened that clearly, and then of course the Scola thing, which we just talked about. I had a source, and I think another thing we didn't talk about last time I was on, I looked at the the Italian influential Italian gentleman thing, that whole thing, but I found proof that it was always alleged that did he talk up Bergoglio. I found proof, and actually I think Julia Maloney cited me in the book for that. There was a nun who said, yeah, he was like going around like crazy touting the praises. But the other thing I found out is I had a source who told me on the night of the election of Francis, the source met McCarrick, and McCarrick said, according to the source, we did it. And the source said, I have an article in there in the Conclave Chronicles on it. I'm sort of paraphrasing. Basically, he got the sense, now because he's speaking now, so how much of this is informed by what people have said, but he said he got the sense that there was campaigning. So it just confirms, so he got the sense that McCarrick was operating in concert with others to get him elected. So it's just more evidence of kind of the campaigning thing, but then it comes back to the simony question that I was just discussing, and whether or not that's enough to really undo an election. I'd say probably not, but that I'm a layman, I'm not a canon lawyer. That's my sense of where that would be.
Well, canon law ranks very, very lowly versus a papal document like Universi Dominici Grigi.
Or there. I mean, because I should say University UDG explicitly not allows, but it says simony would not invalidate an election. It doesn't really say what happens in the case of campaigning, but really campaigning is simony without
canvassing, right? Does he mean campaign? I think he says, I'm gonna have to go check it now. I think he says it would be a late sententiae excommunication. I think
that's with simony too, I believe. I might be wrong, but I think that it is with that, but he said it would not invalidate.
How could someone be excommunicated as a formal cooperator? Formal cooperation being JP2 just wrote stuff and didn't even know what he was writing a lot of times, I think. But literally, yeah, if you this is just formal cooperation with grave matter is basically it's you're doing it yourself. This isn't material proximate cooperation or anything like that. Formal cooperation is you're doing it. So if you accept the canvassing or campaigning, then you also have to be late sententiae excommunicated. So how can you be excommunicated and be pope? And we're back to that old issue.
Yeah, I think it's obvious that whatever happened, that Bergoglio wanted it and was part of the planning of it. And I think in my mind, there's no doubt. Now, whether or not in terms of like a trial, we would need somebody on the inside to come forward to kind of give that smoking gun. Oh yeah, I was part of that conversation. I was there. And whether or not some of these piecing things together from books and press articles are sufficient enough to make the case, it's certainly enough to say there's a lot of smoke, and there might be. But I think we would probably need, I think, two problems. One, you would need that kind of evidence, that type of person to step forward. Number one is that smoking gun evidence. And then the second part of the problem is, does it withstand the test of universal acceptance. That would be, I think, probably her, because I kind of think there probably is evidence of more smoking gun. Like the person I always wonder probably has more. Again, I'm not saying he does, but he's a very odd character, and Francis treats him very oddly. Is Cardinal Bechu, the former Cardinal Bechu?
Right.
I mean,
right.
he had decardinaled him at one point. Then he kind of made him kind of a cardinal again, and then even though he was on the outs of Francis on Easter weekend, I think on Holy Thursday, Francis went over and celebrated it or had mass with him and in Bechu's private apartment. Who does that? This is a guy that supposedly did all these horrible financial transactions, allegedly. So why is Francis cozying up? So there's a lot of strange things. I have a couple of 2-3 articles on Bechu. I mean, Bechu, in one of his interviews, I think in court, said he was afraid that Francis was going to kill him. So, and Bechu was there.
I remember that now.
And Bechu was the sostituto, basically number 3 guy at the Vatican under Benedict. So he was there. He was, I think, linked to Sodano. Sodano is was kind of a bad character. He did not like Benedict. He was pro Francis. So I think that's part of the reason why a lot of the Italians ended up kind of ditching Scolo, was in part because of Sodano's influence. I think he was working in concert with the St. Gallen Mafia, I would think, in terms of trying to win votes for Francis, is my guess. Right. So, but anyway, so Bechu, I think just there's so many weird things to his friends. And my thought is this what accounts for the strange behavior on Francis's part, kind of in keeping him close, but then kind of leaning on him heavily. Does Bechu, I wonder, have something on Francis? And so I kind of wonder if Bechu in the end will get off scot-free or relatively unscathed in all his current travails and Vatican courts and things.
What do you make of Julian Maloney's book, St. Gallen Mafia?
Well, it's a great book. Great book.
Yeah,
it's a great resource to understanding the group and who they are, their goals, and all that. So great book. I highly recommend it.
So you do believe, I'm gathering, Stephen, that Francis is implementing, is instantiating the St. Gallen Mafia agenda?
Absolutely. I think he could not have accomplished as much as he did if he came in at a standing start. I mean, obviously, I think he came in with an agenda. He was working to become Pope. I think that's pretty clear. I mean, that's just like from public sources and the reporting, like I said, Henry Sira and all that. I think seems obvious to me, at least, that he was the candidate for the St. Gallen Mafia. I mean, I think that's clear.
Well, it's always good. People really need to go look at Roma Locuta Est. That's your blog, and also at the what do you call them?
It's an article that has a whole bunch of links to my other articles on the subject. It's called the Conclave Chronicles. So if folks just do a Google search on Stephen O'Reilly Conclave Chronicles, they'll get that, and it'll tell you who I think the influential Italian gentleman was, that famous character who met with McCarrick, another strange oddity of the whole conclave period back in 2013. The Scola, it's a 2-part series in there. So I think this stuff is pretty interesting. You
mean the one that McCarrick mentioned at a speech at Villanova?
Yeah. Villanova.
Yep. You'll have to tell me who you think that is after we go off the air. Everyone go read Stephen O'Reilly's stuff at Roma Locuta Est. It's really, really, really good. And that's why I've been wanting to have you back on for a while.
Like it.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll call it there. Everyone go check his stuff out. Everybody stay tuned. Francis is probably Pope. And this is unprecedented badness, but the Roman Catholic faith is the way. Don't leave for Eastern Orthodoxy. Remember, Cardinal Casper got his plan that we're attacking, that you're considering leaving the church for from the Eastern Orthodox. Literally, he got it direct. He lifted it directly from the Eastern Orthodox, the internal forum plan for giving communion to divorced and civilly remarried from them. So you don't say, oh, it's so bad. We now have communion for divorced and civilly remarried. It's so bad. I'm going to go someplace better. And then you go to the source for the document.
They invented it.
They invented it. Yeah. Stay here. Don't fly off the right side of the bark. Things will become clear soon, but please don't pope-splain. Just labor straightward onward, Christian soldiers, with your families. God bless you.
I could just add one thing then too. A similar vein is that I think as folks look at this and wonder, things are so bad, and they are bad. But you could imagine maybe a Catholic living in the time of Pope Honorius saying, "Oh, how could we have a pope who could favor heresy?" Or in the time of Pope John the 22nd, when he made some errors publicly on the beatific vision. You know, how could that happen? So we know how far. We don't know how far the Lord would allow things to go, how bad. We know there is a limit in terms of Pastor Eternus and what the rules are or the conditions are for infallibility. So we know what the ultimate red line is. We don't know how far the Lord might allow us to be tested in our faithfulness up to that point. So yeah, don't jump ship. You know, stay on the bark of Peter.
Amen. God bless you, Stephen. God bless you, Parish Rovers and Retrograde. Stay tuned for CMAS tomorrow morning. Des Volt, we all carry on.